why do we call this letter a W when it clearly looks more like a double V? In fact, English is one of the few European Latin script languages that has this name for the letter, the others being Portuguese, Scottish Gaelic, and Scots, a descendant of English. Most others label it as a double V, like in the French W, Italian doppia V, and Finnish tupla V. So why the difference, and which is correct? We will first need to explore the origins of the letter. In classical Latin, as spoken in ancient Rome, the W phoneme was represented by what we would call the letter V, as in the words awe, vexillum, and veni, vidi, vici. In fact, this letter in classical Latin was U, and both pointed and rounded symbols here would represent the letter U, perhaps making more sense of the true pronunciation of these words. In most cases, the word vexillum would appear spelled like this. Different appearances of the letter U, either having curved or straight lines, often came down to handwriting and engraving conventions, similar to how different writers and typesets today might represent G, K, or F differently. A voiced V sound did not exist in Latin until much later on, and the letter W did not appear in the Latin alphabet at this time. In Romance languages, which descended from Latin, the W sound is fairly rare among native words. But where approximates of the sound do occur, they're often represented with other graphemes. In French, the words moi, ouest, and oui approximate the sound as a glide between vowels, using the letters OI and OU. In Spanish, something like W appears in bueno, and in Italian buono. The written W is mainly used for loanwords, as in whiskey, weekend, and website. The use of a true W sound as a consonant is fairly rare among most European languages entirely. In modern German, where the W phoneme is not used for native words, a written W is pronounced as the V phoneme. However, this is an example of the differing evolutions of the Germanic language family. In Western Germanic languages, as spoken during the early Middle Ages, the W sound was native and descended into Old English before developing into V in more modern versions of German. This also explains why the sound also exists in Dutch, although often with a modification moving more towards a V. Old English was initially written with the Futhorc Runic alphabet, and the W sound was represented with the Wynn rune. Using these runes, the word wief, meaning wife, and wolf would be written as so. So why did the English language adopt the Latin alphabet? After all, Runic was used by a culture that had replaced the domination of the Romano-British, and spoke a language not descended from Latin. The reasons were both cultural and practical. The spread of Christianity to the British Isles in the 6th and 7th centuries reintroduced Latin as the language of the Church. The vast majority of written texts at this time were religious in nature, and this facilitated the transition from the Runic alphabet to the Latin from the 7th century. Runic was suited well to engravings, being mostly formed as straight lines, whereas Latin letters were far more practical for writing longer text using ink on parchment. In using the Latin alphabet for a Germanic descended language, the problem of missing letters arose. For some sounds, modified Latin letters were used, like the eth, representing the v and th sounds interchangeably. As English evolved, this would be represented by the digraph th. This sound was also represented by the thorn, which was borrowed from the Runic alphabet and stayed in common English orthography until the 14th century. For the W sound, another new letter was needed. Using a letter U, as the Romans would have, might have created complications, since Old English had its own developments of sounds that were represented by the letter U. Remember, the pointed U, what we'd recognize as a V today, was still just another style for the letter U. In order to make the W sound, scribes initially experimented with a combination of two U's together, literally a double U. This may have reflected the rounded lip articulation of W, which is similar to the lip rounding used for U. This practice was superseded by a preference to borrow a runic letter, the Wynn. Its shape changed into the more rounded version as we see in many Old English texts. The Wynn survived in English orthography until around the 12th century. By this time, adherence to Latin script and a growing unfamiliarity with runes prompted another revision back to the W. This did occasionally create awkward clusters when appearing next to other U's, as in wolf. The W became joined as scribes wrote at speed, often written with straight lines, much like a pointed U, and looking more like the letter we recognize today. Another interesting element to throw in the mix is that before the development of Middle English, there was no native V sound. The closest sound was the F phoneme and letter F, which developed into the V sound gradually. This explains the irregular spelling of the word of in modern English, and mirrors a similar convention in Welsh where the letter F represents the V sound. The V sound did exist in Old French, however. The Latin Wynnum changed to Vinum in Vulgar Latin before descending into the Romance languages, hence the words va, vino, and their cognates around Europe. This voiced V sound entered the English language as a result of French influence in the late Middle Ages in words like voice and very. The letter V developed into not just another style for U, but a separate letter to represent its own sound. The letter W was adopted into Old High German orthography and came to represent the V sound, as W developed into V in modern German. This then passed into Polish orthography as well, which has the same letter-sound relationship. So should the letter be called W or double V? Technically, if following the evolution from the Latin U to the English W and onto its further developments, W is more orthographically correct. However, since many languages only use the letter for loanwords, it cannot be considered native to them, and on the basis of cultural norms, the name of double V can just as easily be applied. After all, languages do change, and the names of letters might be just as acceptable a change, especially when describing what you can see in front of you. For more history and linguistics, subscribe to the channel and look out for more content on these islands.